It is easier to count the waves of the sea, the drops of rain, the stars, and with a glance to see all the Atlantic, than to recount in detail God's marvels accomplished through St. Nicholas. I'm Encyclopedia Green. Today I'm like our subject, enigmatic and multifarious, variously known as Kris Kringle, Sinterklaas, Père Noël, Father Christmas. You might know him as Santa Claus. Today I'm going to tell you the complete history of a folk hero, and I'm far from the first to promise to do that. Over the last 10 years I've read countless true histories of Christmas, countless secret origins of Santa Claus. I can tell you, having read most of the medieval sources they're based on, almost none of them get it even close to right. That's because they're fixated on this idea of Santa as an individual, or Santa as a character that you can follow a through line through history. Even the best Santa scholars end up doing this a lot. But Santa is a spectrum. That's right, Santa is made up of many factors, none of which are strictly necessary, but some of which must be there, some combination. Of course, there's the more canonical things. If your Santa isn't fat and happy and giving gifts to children, people will have questions. But in theory, you can create a Santa by just kind of reaching into the bag and grabbing what's there. And in fact, if you look over Europe, you're going to find examples of Santa that kind of seem like they've done that. Where did they come from? Where did the Santa of the Americas come from? Who's St. Nicholas? Well, ultimately, I think this question comes down to one of historical origin. Who Santa is depends on where Santa hails from, literally and figuratively. Let's start with the literal one. Do you have an answer? If you said Turkey, sure. That's good trivia right there. If you said the Netherlands, you might be a little bit more on point. If you said Asgard, we can be best friends. None of those are correct, by the way, but none of them are strictly wrong either. Let's get to it. Once upon a time, there was a pagan solstice celebration that was later changed and revised into a Christian celebration of Jesus' birth, but it retained many of its original sort of habits and characters. At some point, someone named St. Nicholas lived and then died. At some point later, he supplanted Jesus as the figurehead of this hybrid holiday. At some point much more recently, he transfigured from a historical figure to some kind of magical elf man with various powers and abilities and roles in society, all of which vary wildly between cultures. And then more recently than that, the anatomically modern Santa appeared in America and kind of supplanted all of the others. With these four parts, we've got a very simple story, but it's already kind of wildly complex. I mean, at a minimum, you've got Roman festivities with a Christian narrative, a pre-medieval historical figure, and American immigrant traditions all mixed together over the course of more than 2,000 years. It's easy to get lost. If I want to tell the complete history of Santa, we're going to need more than 4 parts. Let's do 24. An advent of Santa, which raises a prominent linguistic problem. It's going to get real confusing if I'm trying to switch between referring to specific characters like St. Nicholas, Sinterklaas, and Santa Claus, and then talking broadly about Santas, Ur-Santas, Proto-Santas. So the term Santa will refer to the mythic archetype in its totality, encompassing all incarnations, and any individual name, including Santa Claus, which refers to the modern American version, that'll be one particular incarnation. Part 1. The Ur-Santas. These are the characters that are older than Santa, older than St. Nicholas, older than Christmas, but have over time become inextricably linked to Santa. In fact, let's start with the most basic one, the Yule goat. This is a Scandinavian tradition, and I've chosen it as the origin not because we have strong reason to believe that it's older than any of the others. In fact, for this entire section, please think of these characters as contemporaries. The Yule goat, however, is the simplest, because he is what it is, a goat that visits right around Christmas. The thing about goats is that they're an amazing all-in-one animal. They can provide milk, which gives you butter and cheese. They can help with agriculture. They can be your best friend. And if you want to, you can eat them. But the thing is, once you eat them, you don't get any of the other stuff. So it's very natural for animals like this, animals that have a lot to give, to end up becoming central in some sort of tradition, to be slaughtered only on special occasions. Morbid as that is, it's a little bit sweet as well. Saturn and Roman roots. When people say a pagan solstice celebration that Christmas was based on, they probably mean Saturnalia, a festival that happened around the right time of year and does include some Christmassy things, mostly because both include feasting. Saturnalia is built around the god Saturn, which makes him our Santa, and he really doesn't have any Santa traits that the Yule goat doesn't have, except for maybe being in the shape of a man. The important thing about Saturnalia isn't that it's the origin of Christmas, which you will sometimes hear. It wasn't the first Christmas, and Christmas wasn't adapted one for one from it. Christmas was adapted based on whatever previous traditions existed in the locality where that Christmas was beginning to happen when it became Christian. So that means any pagan roots. That includes Romans, obviously. Christianity happened to flourish at the end of the Roman Empire, but it also includes Celtic stuff, Nordic stuff, Goth, Visigoth, you name it. So the important thing here is that Christmas is based on continuing a tradition with a Christian vibe added on top, to make the local guy who's really mad about that calm down a little bit.
Wodan and the Nordic traditions.
Wodan and Thor are both characters that have been called Santa or Santa originators, or Santas, at some point. This is sort of correct, but it's correct in a very weird, circuitous way. So the way I would put it is that Wodan as a character is literally based on Santa, and Santa as a character is literally based on Wodan. How did that happen? How could that even be possible? Well, there is a pre-existing Wodan, one that's largely lost to time. The character that actually existed in the culture of the Norse people who followed him as a god. The primary sources we have describing this are very limited, and one of the most complete are the poetic and prose Eddas, which were both penned by a Christian who had a habit of intentionally rewriting the religion in order to make it more familiar. One thing he would do is recast these gods as Christian-like figures, which is where you get a bit of savior stuff with Thor and a little bit of devil stuff with Loki. But the most important thing for us to understand here is that he was operating from actual Norse sources, and therefore gives us a lot of insight we wouldn't otherwise have into what these characters were like. But in becoming the only source we have, he fundamentally undermines our ability to separate Wodan from this Christianized Wodan. So at the end of the day, when people were looking in this region and trying to understand the winter holiday traditions, looking for Santas to find, what they found were reconstructed Wodans, characters who, at various points in history, had been pulled back from the historical record based on things like the poetic and prose Eddas, and reconfigured, containing both their Christian elements and their original Norse elements. And that happened multiple times, which means that our modern conception of Wodan has included some of these Santa traditions, and some of those Santa traditions probably hail from Wodan. However, it is not correct to say that Wodan or Thor are actual Santas. They're Santas. They're characters that became linked to the character later. My primary source for this, and I have a lot of them, I've been studying this for more than 10 years, my primary source for today's project, which is understanding Santa as a character, is Charles W. Jones's St. Nicholas of Myra, Bari, and Manhattan. And Jones has a more hardline stance on this than I do, but we do agree that Wodan was not the original Santa. Quote,
"One reads in newspaper columns these days that Nicholas is but a sanctified Odin, or Wodan, who rode on a white horse in winter night. This is a legend of a legend, and no older than the 19th century anthropologists. Wodan himself is a pretty misty figure, largely created by those same anthropologists."
Krampus and the Celtic world. First of all, Krampus is not a proper noun, or at least not necessarily. It can be. There is a Krampus, but there are also other Krampuses. Think of it like the word devil. The devil is a guy, but you can be a devil, like a race of devilish beings, and you can have adjectives and adverbs like devilish or devilishly. Krampus might mean claw. It generally refers to these shaggy, horned, monstrous creatures that are intentionally a little bit satanic and ultimately rooted in tutelary gods from various regions in the Celtic world and beyond. By beyond, I mean barbarian culture, which in itself means not Roman. It's just a catch-all term they used for anybody from the north, which, if you know where the Roman Empire is quite a lot of different people. It's the same as like how pagan just means non-Christian. In most cases today, Krampus is a companion of St. Nicholas, someone who comes along, but he usually has his own day, or week, Krampusnacht, the Nights of Krampus, where a Krampuslauf occurs, a Krampus run, a public event where a bunch of devils in devil costumes run around the streets whipping people who've been naughty. Christians basically always interpret other people's gods and religious practices as devils and devil worship. So any character that is a demon or a devil that accompanies like a Christian character historically, you can bet your bones that that was actually a pre-existing tutelary god of some kind, being rooted to a particular place or people that we don't necessarily have the name for anymore. All right. St. Nicholas, who again, we're not close to getting to, had a habit of wandering the world and battling demons or even outwitting them to bind them to his service and force them to do good. He would make them wear the chains of St. Peter, and you can often see those shackles in the costumes today. The Krampus' domain is the naughty end of the naughty-nice spectrum. They're to threaten children so they'll behave well. And those threats are often pretty nightmarish, things like getting eaten or dismembered, but he's not best understood as an evil character, in my opinion. He is working with Santa, kind of not under his own free will, but kind of as a form of community service, as a reformation. He's a good guy with dark methods. As Chris Sims put it, Batman to Santa's Superman. Some other notable Krampuses include the Klaubauf, which might come from an Austrian phrase Klaubauf, meaning pick 'em up. It's part of a game where you throw apples and nuts on the floor, and children try to pick them all up. It's like a piñata without the hitting part. There's also Satan, the devil himself. In some regions, Satan accompanies Santa and performs as the heavy. Again, as a sort of compassionate, friendly member of this process, which is actually a lot closer to his roots, but I just don't have time to get into it. But Krampus isn't always a companion, either. He's not always with St. Nicholas, and that makes sense, since he's older than that character. St. Nicholas was placed there on top of pre-existing Krampus traditions of some kind. Perchta, at once a Santa and a Krampus. Perchta was a new character that I discovered this year, and I really, really like her. She's both Santa and Krampus, a sort of two-faced being, sometimes appearing as an old, evil witch that will cut you open and fill your body with straw if you're naughty, and sometimes just as like a really nice lady who I don't actually know if she gives gifts, but she's not murdering anybody, so that's nice. Perchta is Freya, is somewhat literally. By tradition, it's kind of rooted in that same Norse mythology, meaning that this is a very extant Norse god that's still part of people's seasonal traditions to this day, even though those people don't practice the Norse religion. History is weird. Notable incarnations of Perchta include La Befana, a mostly friendly witch whose origin story is that she has the worst FOMO in history. The three wise men stayed at her inn and invited her to meet the baby Jesus, but she decided to stay home and sweep for some reason. In her story, she sort of wanders the world trying to catch up, kind of eternally trying to make up for this mistake. Frau God is more of a specter or a haunt, a being that kind of wanders your village, and it's not great that she's there, but the thing she does is amazing. So, she doesn't come into your house. She has 12 tiny dogs, and the dogs come in your house. And depending on how you treat the dog, you'll either get good luck or be cursed. Frau God rules. The monsters of Christmas. There's a debate growing more popular every year here in America about whether or not Christmas has been surpassed by Halloween. And I kind of understand it. Halloween is more inclusive. It's got kind of a more broad spectrum of appeals, from the spoopy for children to your absolute worst fears if you're really, really nasty. But the thing is, why not both? 13th century Icelandic folklore tells us of Grýla, the hideous mountain witch. She's great because she's sort of a Goosebumps level threat. In theory, what she wants to do and what she's capable of is horrifying, but you can just scare her away or offer her bread in order to keep her from kidnapping your children. That she wants to eat your children. It's the thing she likes to do. There's also the Yule lads, her children, 13 guys who have, let's say, mischief on their minds. But the thing that's great about the Yule lads is they only do one thing each. They're very specific. So, spoon licker, he gonna lick your spoons. Pot scraper, he gonna scrape your pots. Gully gawker, he hides in gullies and tries to steal milk from cows that walk by, I think. I'm not gonna mention gully gawker. I can't talk about gully gawker. A doorway sniffer doesn't actually smell doors. He reaches his very large nose around doors to see if you have any bread to steal. Julekatteren, or the Yule cat, is probably a recent fabrication from the 19th century, but apparently is the pet of Grýla, and therefore part of this weird, mismatched family. Julekatteren has a real problem if you're not dressed well, and will eat anybody who doesn't have a new set of duds before Christmas. This was probably a tactic by people who owned land to force their peasants to work harder during the Christmas season. It's a little bit sad, but Julekatteren can't be blamed for that. She's just a cat who loves sweaters. Lastly, a cryptid from the Italian town of Valcamonica, the Basilisk, a Yuletide gossip muppet. I should probably tell you what those words mean when they're in that order. So, according to the lore of this particular town, the basilisk is a real animal that lives in the wilderness and kind of observes people year-round. And then, once per year, people go out and capture the basilisk, bring it into town, where it will kind of admonish everybody for all of their misdeeds in an elaborate speech that everybody goes to together for some reason. It apparently speaks in gibberish, gosh, I want to find a video of this. Which came first, the Krampus or the Santa? I want to note, for the sake of transparency, that my primary source does not agree with me on most of the points I've just made, at least not to the degree that I believe them. Charles Jones writes,
I share with Meissen a disbelief in the great antiquity of Nicholas, the elf or sprite. Evidence, or the absence of it, leads me to believe that Old Nick, Nicker, and Nix are but desanctified Nicholas, and not Aryan daemons.
What he's trying to say is that these traditions, these Yuletide monsters that are associated with St. Nicholas in various places, might not be as old as people think. And it's a perfectly valid position to take on this case. Honestly, I can't really fault him. It's more extreme than I would go, but he's not wrong. We don't know that the Krampus is older than Nicholas. That's just what people say. But it's also very plausible. And we know from the tradition of the Poetic Eddas that Christians did a lot of stuff to sort of wipe out all of these pre-existing traditions. The Celtic, Alpine, Slavic, Gothic, Visigothic, etc., all of these people, a lot of their cultures didn't develop written language until much, much later than places like Rome. Charlemagne was illiterate when he took over. He was a barbarian, and he became a Roman emperor without knowing how to read. There's a cute story from one of his biographies of him staying up at night and reading under candlelight, even though his rector told him not to. The important thing to note here is that we shouldn't necessarily expect there to be any kind of record of these characters, but it's not plausible on its face that nothing was there to begin with. People were celebrating some kind of festivities. People had some kind of religion. The one that we have, the one that they claim is older than Christmas, it's the only thing we could believe. So, am I taking a bit of a leap? Sure. But so is Jones. Regarding the trail of evidence of the life of St. Nicholas.
This makes it hard for the biographer. No longer are there documents to prove a case. Rather, there is just enough evidence to know that Nicholas lived on in obscurity, but not enough to make us certain why. Suggestions must suffice.
We have to build on shaky ground regardless. So, I acknowledge that my position is less well evidenced than Jones's. I'm speculating. I'm trusting oral tradition, it's shaky. But the fact of the matter is that the stronger evidence exists on Jones's side only because of a long-standing, completely unjustified Eurocentric tradition whereby Christian sources were preserved over all others and non-Christian sources were redacted and revised to fit within Christian worldviews. And I'm just not here to participate in that. We're going to come back to Jones a lot later to talk about one other thing I strongly disagree with him about, specifically that it's not a coincidence that Krampus was disappearing right when Santa was first appearing.
Part 2. Nicholas, Bishop of Myra.
Gustav Onric, who wrote the sort of definitive work, judging basically all the textual sources that exist, concluded that
to dispute the historicity of a bishop of Myra named Nicholas would be a methodological error. We can grant a bishop of that name who had a great impact on his homeland. We can also accept December 6th as the day of his death and burial. These are all the facts we can hold to. Further, we cannot go.
A Saint's Life is a book written about a person who did enough miracles that someone believes they should qualify as a major part of the Christian religion going forward. Hagiographies are a little bit like a viral Facebook post about a Christian poning a lib or some atheist college professor. They're not really meant to be believed on faith or believed as factually true. They're there to spread a particular story. And if challenged, anyone who liked that post would probably be willing to admit that it might be made up, but the idea of it is true. The thing it represents is true. It's a current in our society, even if this individual example is fabricated. I'm not saying these books contain no truth at all, and I'm not saying that they're purely made up, and I'm not saying they're a mixture of the two. I'm saying that the fiction-nonfiction distinction isn't the right one to be thinking about here. I don't want to get into the nuances of Plutarch and friend of the channel, Pliny the Elder, who are not best understood as nonfiction writers, but certainly weren't just making everything up. Wandering Christians would occasionally gather followers as they traveled through Asia and Rome, and when they died, especially if they were gruesomely martyred, a cult might spring up around them. These cults were often the source of at least the claims, if not the written hagiographies themselves. Later on, when the church was more established, when there was a thing called the Catholic Church in a real sense, the hagiography shifted to being sort of a letter of recommendation you'd write about somebody to try to get them venerated as a saint after the fact. Because in order to become a saint, you had to, 1, be a really good Christian, 2, be dead, and 3, have worked provable miracles. So what are the miracles of Nicolaus? The friend to all children. According to the hagiographies, Nicolaus was a very serious child. And by child, I mean newborn infant. It says that he stood up on his first day of life, and without ever having been told or even being able to speak, he began fasting, abstaining from breastfeeding on Wednesdays and Fridays. So he's often touted as this sort of paragon children should look up to, and might have been held over some of their heads if they were petulant at supper, in the same way that modern parents might tell someone to finish their food because there are children starving in China or Russia or, the United States. This is important, but it's also important how he operated at school, where he was a singularly focused student who never played or looked at girls. He was also elected bishop at 19, which is pretty young for a bishop. The story goes that some Myran priests weren't sure who should succeed the bishop after he died. They were told by an angel in a vision that they should elect whoever first walked in the front door the next morning. And who should be there but pious Nicholas himself? This led to a surprisingly long-lasting tradition of electing boys as bishops for a day, which, that's a thing we do nowadays, but it's symbolic when we do it. In this case, they appear to have actually been invested with some amount of power, that is, children who were, literally, elected as bishop in certain places to celebrate St. Nicholas. This is a bad plan, and yes, many of them decided to drink all the communion wine or throw parties. It caused a lot of problems with old-fashioned types who thought that sort of stuff wasn't really good to do at church. And I normally don't agree with those people about anything, but I do agree about this. This also happened at schools, where a boy might become the schoolmaster for a day. And that tradition seems to have lasted the longest and might have a lot to do with how Nicholas remained very firmly associated with young boys all the way into the modern era.
A Christian Superman.
Nicolaus's parents died when he was 19 and left him a tremendous fortune, one that he quite rightly recognized as a sort of burden on his soul. He wanted desperately to get rid of it. He was looking for any worthy cause. And then he heard that a local man was about to sell his 3 daughters into sexual slavery. So, in the dead of night, Nicolaus came to that man's house and left 3 bags of gold on his windowsill. The man chased him and actually caught him, but Nicolaus insisted that the man never speak of who had given him the money. Not because he was worried other people would ask, that was all the money he had. This is often touted as the origin of the gift-giving tradition in Christmas, and that's definitely not true. It's kind of the other way around. This might have been one of the things about Nicolaus that made him seem Christmassy to people. Another more significant story is the tale of the 3 doomed soldiers. Nicolaus rescued them from execution. In some versions of the tale, he actually caught the sword mid-swing. Regardless, this pissed off whoever had ordered that execution, who went straight to the Emperor Constantine. Constantine is said to then have taken a night to sort of consider it, and in his dreams he was visited by an angel who told him that the men were innocent, that Nicholas was a pretty based guy he should hang out with more, and maybe he should consider becoming Christian and making that the state religion of Rome, just maybe.
Sailors and Poseidon.
Many of Nicolaus's churches are coastal, including some that we believe were converted temples of Poseidon. For many, many centuries, sailors would pray to Nicolaus for safe passage across the ocean, and wouldn't even leave port without 3 loaves dedicated to him, bread offerings you'd literally toss into the ocean at the first sign of bad weather. If you ask, Nicholas will quell storms for you. He'll rescue people who've already drowned, bringing them back to life. If your ship founders or wrecks, he might teleport you to your destination, where you will arrive, clothes soaking wet. And he continued doing this long after his death. In one account, he rescued William the Conqueror when he fell into a river. This Nicolaus is very much a superhero who swoops in at the last possible second to rescue somebody, usually using superpowers. The important thing to understand here is that this version of Nicolaus, who will be the dominant version for quite a long time, is a folk hero kind of in the vein of Robin Hood or Cuchulainn. He's not really as violent as either of those guys. He usually resolves things by yelling, but there are the occasional acts of violence, and one particular slap that kind of changed history.
The Council of Nicea.
Let's talk about pivotal moments of history. For the first few centuries of Christendom, there were huge differences of opinion about what beliefs the religion was actually composed of. The Council of Nicea was convened by Constantine to settle these disputes, and Constantine was pretty jazzed about converting the Roman Empire into a Christian empire. He never actually did that, but he got really close. And he couldn't really take those first steps until there was some minimal agreement as to what Christianity was actually about. Major figures, still hailed today as architects of the church, disagreed about which books were authentic, what Christ had said and done, and even whether or not Jesus was technically God. The Council of Nicea included all of the significant figures alive at the time. They got together to settle the score with Arius the heretic. He was the main guy teaching that Jesus was divine but subordinate to Hashem. He'd been born, which either meant he was created at some point or possibly exalted from a human status to something divine, making them equals later, but not initially. According to hagiographic legend, Nicolaus was at this council, and he became so incensed at these claims of a less divine Jesus that he slapped Arius in the face, and then was arrested, because you can't do that in front of the Roman emperor. By the 13th century, the legend had grown to include Nicolaus getting involved in this entire jailbreak narrative led by Jesus and Mary. The supporting evidence is entirely hagiographical. The works that support it also claim that he raised people from the dead, dispelled horrible storms with a gesture, and went toe-to-toe with Artemis, goddess of the hunt, and won. I'm making this video to clarify a lot of the things that I've been confused about over the years that I've been studying this particular set of historical traditions, because more often than not, sources will flit between historical claims and Christian apologetics. Apologetics is about defending the faith. The intention is never to evaluate the evidence and follow it where it goes, but to search for supporting evidence. Not to give context to the stories of Santa, but to argue by any means in favor of a specific conclusion about Santa. Apologists will present their faith-based beliefs as if they were supported by the same historical record that backs their historical beliefs. For example, we have about a dozen lists of people who attended the Council of Nicea. Nicolaus does not appear on the 3 written by attendees. He doesn't appear on any sources until at least the 13th century. The Golden Legend, just about the second most popular book of the medieval period after the Bible, claims Nicolaus was there. The evidence is clear. We don't see any signs of Nicolaus from the contemporary sources. He was obscure during his life, and for a few centuries after. Then there's a major shift, and he suddenly is wildly popular. At this point, we start seeing sources appear that are claiming that he was involved in various important historical moments. So it's kind of like when Sherlock Holmes or King Arthur shows up in a TV show about time travel alongside real historical figures. That doesn't imply, really, that either of those people existed or that they didn't. It doesn't even really imply that the writers believed those people existed. They could be just taking some kind of literary license for any number of reasons. Still, it's fitting for Nicholas to find his way to Nicaea without actually being there. As his legend grows, he will appear wherever he is needed, instantaneously, no matter the distance.
Why was Nicholas so venerated?
In one survey of 4,637 Greek churches, 752 were devoted to Mary, 359 to Nicolaus, 196 to Athanasius, and so on. One Eastern prayer, the Christkind liturgy, lists Mary, Michael, and Gabriel, and then our fathers among the saints, great hierarchs and ecumenical doctors, Basil the Great, Gregory the Theologian, and Chrysostom, Athanasius, and Cyril, Nicholas of Myra, and all holy hierarchs. The thing is, Mary is the mother of Jesus. Michael and Gabriel are literally archangels. These other names, they're the guys of Eastern Orthodoxy, the men who built the church. They were prolific authors, and their writings did more to establish what Eastern Christianity is than almost anyone else. Except for St. Nicholas, who, as far as we know, never wrote anything at all. It's very strange how prominent he is, considering how little we know.
Tearing down the temple of Artemis.
When Nicolaus was young, the Roman Empire was actively persecuting Christians. When he was an old man, Constantine and Licinius made Christians into a protected class by passing a whole bunch of civil rights legislation. In 380, after all of those guys were dead, Christianity became the state religion, paving the way for them to persecute other religions for centuries to come. There was this huge polemic shift in the 4th century during Nicolaus's life. Christians went from being fearful of Roman temples, treating them as the haunts of demons, to regarding them more as the homes of fake gods and the charlatans who imagined them into being. Legends about Nicolaus line up with this. In one pivotal narrative, he faces off against Artemis, who is just the devil in disguise. She tries to smuggle a firebomb into Myra, but Nicolaus senses her immediately. He's the guardian of ships and the sea, and the bishop of Myra. Myra's port is his sanctum sanctorum. He defeats her effortlessly. Why he was at war with Artemis in particular isn't clear. It might simply have been that Artemis was a very popular figure to worship. Regardless, Nicolaus's greatest achievement will be destroying her final temple. And this is probably a real event, but like Nicaea, it probably did not include Nicolaus originally. It's attributed to a whole mess of saints at the very least, so it's very hard to know which, if any, of them were involved.
Part 3. new old traditions emerge.
We've covered the Santas, the figures who've influenced Santa and were later influenced by Santa. We've talked about the legends that comprise Nicolaus's life. He would have been sanctified immediately after his death, if not actively before that. So that covers antiquity up to about the 5th century. December is our month of interest. The 6th is St. Nicholas Day, followed by Advent and the Feast of Innocents. These holy days all had an influence on what Christmas would eventually become, but they are, for now, still very separate and not directly associated with Nicholas, aside from his saint's day, of course.
Kidnappers, murderers, and demons.
Aside from some angelic dream visits, Nicolaus largely works alone, a Golden Age Superman who can find a way to solve any problem using some new version of his existing slate of ocean and combat powers. St. Nicholas, on the other hand, is more of a team player. Before the elves and the toy shops, Nicholas traveled with demons, evil men, and some weird goblins in order to aid people in need. Perchta was a innkeeper who killed and served children as pickled meat to his guests. Hearing this, Nicholas leapt into action, first reviving the children, then binding the men into service as part of his Christmas entourage. Now he is known as Father Whipper. Hans von Trotha was a German knight who feuded with a local monastery of Benedictine monks over a castle that he really liked. To lean on the monks, he dammed the water supply to the entire town of Weissenberg, and when he was ordered to return the water, he destroyed the dam and flooded the town. Now he is known as Hans Trapp. Jacob Grimm, yes, that one, tells us that the heathen gods were nothing but kobolds, house sprites who emerged from the hearth, laughing loud and heartily. You would carve wooden kobolds and then stand them next to wooden bishops to be kept in countenance. He writes, "It is quite a piece of familiar intercourse between these spirits and mankind that, beside the usual appellatives, certain proper names should be given them, the diminutives of Robin and Nissen. Robin, which is the same home sprite whom we in Germany call Knecht Ruprecht and exhibit to children at Christmas. Ruprecht is a real sweetie pie, especially considering his company, the murderer and the terrorist. Unlike his brethren, he doesn't really threaten children, he's not going to skin anybody or kidnap anybody, he just kind of slaps them with a bag of soot if they don't know how to pray. Ash, perhaps a precursor to the coal that his companion, Nissen, or Nicholas, would one day give. Let's not be delicate here. These little helpers are slaves. They're literally wearing shackles. And now that hits different if they're like demons and like monster men, but it's just not always the case.
Zwarte Piet and holiday racism.
I made a big thing at the beginning about being a Santa expert. Of course, my actual opinion is more nuanced. There are many aspects of this story where I don't even qualify as a novice. To be a real Santa expert, I, at the very least, need to be able to read German, and all I've done is read commentaries on Onric. They're good sources, and I think I understand them, but still. This section is about Christmas blackface, characters like Zwarte Piet. I don't have a lot to say. Originally I wrote, not going to dignify this controversy by debating anything. Blackface is bad, these characters are bad, they should be retired. I don't care about anyone's traditions, there are no shortage of other companions to choose from. And then I was going to recommend a video about the topic for anyone who doesn't know about blackface or understand my position, or anyone like me who just hasn't made it a priority to learn a lot about these things. This isn't a short section because I'm not an expert, though. I mean, I'm not, but I didn't want to talk about this because it's not really my place. Like, as a white person, who am I to get mad about this? Who am I to crack jokes? But I realized something while I was turning my notes into a script. I don't really think I understand enough about this to even write a brief section like the one I'd planned, and I've known about Zwarte Piet since I was 12 years old, when I read Me Talk Pretty One Day by David Sedaris. I stand by my original plan for this segment, I don't think it's my place, but I want to acknowledge that I really had every opportunity in the last 10 years to educate myself on this part of Christmas, and I never made it a priority. Anyway, if you, like me, feel like you need to spend more time understanding this part of all of our history, I recommend The Birth of a Fiction by Desmond Tsuga.
Please understand this recommendation comes with the most serious trigger warning I am ever likely to give, no matter how long I keep making videos. If you're looking for a safe video to watch that will still directly engage with this topic, I recommend Tristan Johnson's video on blackface over at Step Back History. And look, I feel that Americans have a responsibility to understand this, to confront this, but that doesn't mean that there's any shame. If you can't handle it right now, please take care of yourself. Christkind, like Santa but tiny and orthodox.
Speaking of getting rid of old traditions, Catholics have a lot of holy days. Even today they do. Most of these are saints' days, traditionally the day of the person's death. Now, you couldn't fit them all into a calendar. Heck, if you assigned every saint there ever was 1 hour a year, you'd still have to drop a few thousand to get there. That's including like every saint, not just the ones that are presently acknowledged by one particular tradition, but still, you can see how this gets out of hand pretty quick. By the end of the medieval period, every day of the year was a holy day somewhere in Christendom, and to the people celebrating the particular day, that saint was critical to their faith. So for hundreds of years, Christians have been in conflict with themselves and with the papal authority, who was trying to control what Christians were, which meant stamping out the occasional saint cult and keeping people focused on what they deemed as canon. From the Council of Toledo in 1473, we hear, "The gauche custom prevailing on Christmas, St. Stephen's, St. John's, Innocents' Day, and others, during solemn masses to introduce into the church hobgoblins, monsters, and everything inappropriate, and to diabolize tumultuously, to shout, to sing songs, and carry on derisory tales which degrade the office and distract the people's spirit from pious things." As Jones put it, though, a ruler who tried to control the customs was as Heracles with the Hydra. The Christkind, or Christ child, is Jesus as Santa, if you'll pardon the heresy there. It's like your grandma giving you pocket buddies for your birthday. Like, it's got Pikachu, but without any of that horrid violence. Surprisingly, Christkind caught on. Ironically, he developed into the patron of a secular market festival. Martin Luther would have been horrified.
Martin Luther and the real war on Christmas.
To be clear, Martin Luther liked Christmas, the holy day, just fine. He liked the Christkind idea because it put more Jesus front and center, and he gave many sermons about the nativity story. He even tried out some secular customs, like giving gifts to orphans. But even that was too pagan for this guy. He saw rival gods everywhere he looked. Now, obviously, his opposition to Christmas-time fun wasn't the reason for the Protestant Reformation. It was merely another thing caused by the same factor that really drove it all, which was the saints. He wanted them out of the religion. This is usually billed as a purely theological opposition to worshipping profane images. That was probably part of it, but call me skeptical, because Christians were not supposed to work on holy days. Even the heavily pruned ecumenical calendar still gave common people like 50 to 100 days a year to themselves to celebrate and rest. Some German princes wrote that the common layfolk are no little oppressed by so great an abundance of feasts and holy days. Isn't that nice? The aristocracy looking out for the little guy? That's what the aristocracy does, right? Look anywhere in history, and you're just going to find so many examples of the aristocracy making sweeping political reform to favor the working class. Luther was a little more honest about what was going on. He wrote, "My reason is this. These saints' days inflict bodily injury on the common man in two ways. He loses a day's work, and he spends more than usual, besides weakening his body and making himself unfit for labor, as we see every day. The Protestant work ethic preaches that you should never, ever put yourself, your needs, your life, liberty, or happiness over the needs of your employer. It stigmatizes anything you do for yourself and suggests that, by rights, your time is only your own if you are too lazy to use it to make someone else rich. Merchants and aristocrats fought against the church so they could force their peasants, slaves, and modicum of people who were actually getting paid in some way to work as close to every day of the year as they could get away with doing." Marx himself wrote that Protestantism clearly performed an important role in the genesis of capital by its commutation of nearly all feasts into working days. Oh, sorry, spoilers. Spoilers for the Protestant Reformation. Fine, we'll fix that in post.
Cromwell, cutting Christmas down to size.
Remember, while most saints were local, they were critical to the people in that locality. By going against saints' days in general, the church was sort of in opposition to nearly all of its membership. Holy days were safer the more popular they were, and hagiographies began to adapt, becoming bolder and embracing just any popular story they could get away with, and then turning it up to make it more exciting. Virtually any time you find a source claiming that Nicholas was a significant historical figure, you can trace it back to this period of history, when normal people were fighting to keep their holy days alive. At the same time, the conservative factions of the church were more critical of these holy days than ever before. The Catholic Church ended up wrestling internally for centuries, trying to compromise on this issue. Oliver Cromwell was less subtle. He didn't just outlaw saints' days, he said churches, literally couldn't celebrate the feast of their patron, and that no such holy day could be celebrated between July 1st and September 29th, as that was harvest time, leaving the big holidays, spring, Easter,
autumn, Halloween, and winter, Christmas. You can't get people not to celebrate Christmas. They'll find a way. And while some adults might buy into the propaganda as to why they shouldn't, kids are more straightforward. Jones writes, "The adults could be held in bond of law, but it was not so easy with the children. In abolishing the rights of St. Nicholas Day and innocence in public, they forced them back into the sentimental bosom of the home, and sometimes the school. Once you give gifts to children and let them out after dark to wear masks and beg, a precedent is established more enslaving than any law."
Christmas comes home with Belschnickel.
The transition from holy day to holiday was complete. Like Grand Moff Tarkin before them, the more the authorities tightened their grasp, the more Christmas traditions would slip through their fingers. Only the public celebrations could really meaningfully be stopped. The feasts, gathering, and frivolity, what people actually liked doing, they weren't going to stop doing those things, they just retreated home. And there, among family, we could celebrate according to our own customs. Plenty of people still went to church, of course, but Christmas itself was never again something to be only found in church, and Nicholas would have to visit each of us separately in the home. Or, the fields.
Part 4. The AMS, or Anatomically Modern Santa.
Let's talk about Belschnickel. Nicholas was a bishop, a stern, pious disciplinarian. Belschnickel was a jolly, dirty, fur-clad hobgoblin. Who would you rather invite to a party? The guy who might fistfight you for not observing some ancient Christian custom, or the guy who has pockets full of candy and nuts? This brings us all the way up to the early 19th century, and Santa Claus is just around the corner, but it will be a little bit more time before he's really ticking most of the important boxes. Belschnickel is sort of an American invention. Belschnickel is a German thing, and Jones seems to think that they're not actually related. He doesn't really articulate why. He has a habit of mentioning evidence which seems to contradict his larger point, and then dismissing it as a one-off, often, distressingly, using plague imagery. Like tuberculosis germs, Nicholas customs are always coming into social body, but germination does not become virulent unless a unique set of conditions and a unique set of men change a latent infection into a plague. He maintains that the early evidence of Belschnickel is one such germ, and that he would only become truly popular later after Santa was around to inspire him. So, if Jones doesn't really believe in any of the stuff that I've said so far, what does he believe?
The Knickerbocker Hypothesis.
According to Jones, there are no signs of Santa Claus in the historical record before around 1810. He searched through newspapers, journals, letters, popular literature, all sorts, and while he found these occasional mentions of St. Nicholas and Belschnickel and Sinterklaas, they hadn't really coalesced into Santas. They were folk characters who were visiting around the right time of year, and that was just about it. Until 1809, when Washington Irving published A Knickerbocker's History of New York. That book contains the earliest attestations that St. Nicholas arrived as a Dutch Christmas custom. It mentions Santa Claus 25 times. Irving's Santa delivers gifts wrapped in tinsel, slides down chimneys, rides a sleigh, and even puts his finger to the side of his nose, an image most people will know from A Visit from St. Nicholas, a poem most people will know from its opening line, "'Twas the night before Christmas." And it is Irving's Santa. Despite the title, A Knickerbocker's History is a work of comedic satire. It's filled with fabrications and exaggerations. It was written under a pen name. And Jones couldn't find recognizable Santas from before it was published, but afterwards they're just very popular. The claims about ancient or even medieval Santa customs, then, would be folk history, recent revivals of old characters transfigured into new Santas, just as Nicholas was placed at the Council of Nicea.
The Encyclopedia Hypothesis.
It's Christmas, so I'm going to be uncharacteristically bold. I think Jones overstates his case. I accept most of it. I accept that Irving initiated a major shift in folklore, but Jones fails utterly in stating a case for discontinuity. He ascribes a character to early colonists, that they were all trying to escape the old world, that they didn't want any of their old customs, and he cites a few sources that are pretty clearly referring to anti-monarchist sentiments, or people who had literally escaped debt slavery. He says that the few Dutch in New Amsterdam would find no encouragement from the foreign settlers around them to continue these old world customs, a take that suggests that Jones has never even spoken to an immigrant. He writes, "I have not found a single reference to either Nicholas or Santa Claus in the 12 other colonies. It is easiest to imagine that none was ever made. But one reference he did find is from 1773 in a New York newspaper. That one states, 'Last Monday, the anniversary of St. Nicholas, otherwise known as St. A. Claus, was celebrated at Protestant Hall.' And then the next year, it says, 'Monday next, being the anniversary of St. Nicholas, will be celebrated by the descendants of the ancient Dutch families.'
So, I don't know. I kind of feel like I'm missing something here, but 1773 comes before 1809, and that's a direct link between St. Nicholas, Santa Claus, and traditional Dutch festivities. Near as I can tell, he's dismissing this article merely on the grounds that they're celebrating on the wrong day. But, they were clearly celebrating the same thing. Was a Knickerbocker history even a satire then? I mean, not really, not according to Irving, who wrote how few people knew that New York had ever been called New Amsterdam, or had heard of the names of its early Dutch governors, or cared a straw about their ancient Dutch progenitors. The main object of my work was to embody the traditions of our city in an amusing form, to illustrate its local humans, customs, and peculiarities. Jones, that's from your book! Irving's Santa wasn't this original character that was copied and retroactively added to the historical record. It was a lingua franca that allowed diffuse immigrant communities to start celebrating their traditions together again after they'd been stigmatized or even criminalized. That's why I think Belschnickel is real. So obviously he's a real myth that existed. Obviously Belschnickel doesn't exist. It's me, Dwight.
Nast, Coca-Cola, and the signs of the times.
Finally, we find port in recent history. The AMS design, Anatomically Modern Santa, is often credited to the Coca-Cola Company. Often enough that it's on the FAQ of Coca-ColaCompany.com, where they claim that while they hired Haddon Sundblom to illustrate this ad, the AMS design had already existed for a few decades. This isn't even the first Coca-Cola ad to feature Santa. Now, Coca-Cola gives credit to Thomas Nast, and this makes a lot of sense. Nast was an extremely influential political cartoonist. He invented the Republican elephant, but that doesn't really do justice to his legacy, because he didn't invent the Democratic donkey, Uncle Sam, or Columbia, but he's often credited with those characters for the same reason he gets credit for Santa. His work popularized those characters. The symbols existed, but Nast solidified them. Irving, Nast, and Sundblom, these guys didn't invent Santa. They did the same thing as ancient hagiographers. The difference was that these modern figures had access to modern media. It's not a coincidence that Santa had so many diverse depictions over the years, but sort of coalesced in the 1930s and 40s. The information age had begun, and with books, newspapers, radio, and TV, everyone could now base their traditions on a common image. Jones cites this French newspaper from 1965 to try to prove discontinuity. Despite his white beard and bent back, the Father Christmas who nowadays distributes toys to our youngers is one of the youngest persons in modern mythology. Our grandparents knew nothing of him. In France, we began to speak hesitantly of him about 1920, and not until 1949 did the French openly adopt him. But World War II is happening? And fascists, being the smelly fart people they are, they outlawed the Santas. There were anti-Krampus laws in Austria and Germany. There was a Nazi Santa Claus, and like all Nazi symbolism, he was anti-historical, discontinuous from anything real, a tortured reimagining meant to replace something good with a wretched homunculus that fit their twisted worldview. It may have been less overt in Vicky France, but surely only slightly so. There were laws against publicly celebrating Christmas in America and Europe during and around Irving's day. The Protestant Reformation tried to excise St. Nicholas. The Catholic Church tried to de-sanctify Nicolaus. The apparent discontinuity between AMS and these older customs is really the result of these efforts of suppression. Because, no one imagined Santa into being. No one culture has a sole claim to him. The fact of the matter is that Santa has outlived every attempt to destroy him. Those who embrace him have often tried to destroy his confederacy of monstrous companions. Fools. You can't draw a straight line, or even a wobbly one, through history and show us where Santa started and where Santa got to. Santa is a conversation, and anyone can join in if they like.
Thank you for joining me for this frankly haphazard effort to try to summarize everything I know about St. Nicholas and Santa. I'm actually on track to upload in January already with a video that's mostly shot about the Aberdeen Bestiary. That's a very large medieval encyclopedia of animals, which include just so many wonderful efforts by people to draw animals they had never seen. Because that's on track, I'm finally going to be able to start my series of custom animal fact sheets. That's a very specific thing from my childhood. It was like a mail order program where you basically had a subscription and they would send you what amounted to less than one Wikipedia page about an animal every month. I'm going to be doing the animals that show up in the intros of my Animal Corner videos that I don't really get to talk about. So that's the Greenland shark and, let's see if I can remember them. Greenland shark, the bower, it's a bower bird. I can't remember the name of it. I'm not going to look it up. And the Weta, which is a giant cricket from New Zealand, and I'll be uploading my first commentary of a previous video. I might start in chronological order with the grasshopper mouse. I was so happy to find some Jacob Grimm stuff. That's really fun. I wonder if it's Jakob. It's probably Jakob. I'm going to say Jacob, but I don't know.